I'm John Siraj-Blatchford, and this presentation is called The Elephant in the Room, which comes from a conversation that Lynette Brock and I had a couple of years ago. We were talking about students leaving our lecture rooms thinking that play was certainly the most effective way of children learning, and being able to quote the authorities who asserted that, but not really understanding how it worked. And the reason they didn't understand it is because we didn't explain it, and we didn't explain it because we didn't really understand it very well ourselves. So we've spent the last couple of years observing many hundreds of hours of children engaged in play, and also reading lots of texts, and we've come up with what we think is a workable theory for that, and we're going to share it with you in this presentation. So the elephant in the room is how does play really work? And a good place to start, I think, is with the idea of a schema. This is what most developmental psychologists consider is left in your mind after you've learned something. So it's the main item of knowledge, if you like, that you develop. And it's figurative. It's for a very young child, it'll be an image. Increasingly words become very significant, but it's a representation, figurative representation. Now Piaget, in his sensory motor analysis and theory, referred to schemas and schemes also in the mind, which were in the mind and in action. So there were motor operations as well. And these two components to learning, if you like, or knowledge, were part of his theory. Now it's schemes that Chris Athey identified in her work with young children in the 1970s, and many people have taken it up since then in observing and recognizing the very common behaviors that 2 to 4 year olds make: transporting, containing, ordering different things. These are repetitive schemes or operations that children use and are commonly observed. What effective practice suggests is that when you observe it, you note it, and you feed that scheme with different activities. So if the child is transporting, they're moving things from one place to another in the preschool, you can identify perhaps a wheelbarrow for them to carry some bricks, or a shopping bag to carry some fruit. What you're doing, in fact, is applying different schematic contexts for that operation of the scheme, and this distinction is therefore useful even in that assimilation of learning context. Now, we've taken it a stage further to not just talk about how schemes can lead to new schema context, but also think about how children's particular interests and figurative understandings can be used to encourage them to identify new learning in scheme terms, in terms of operations. Now, this isn't unique. We think that this is pretty much how Piaget understood the sensory motor development. And he talked about it in terms of reflexive abstraction. Now, reflexive abstraction, he said, developed within the sensory motor period, but then it went on to be applied in more abstract learning later, and it was a cyclical process. Vygotsky, according to Bert van Eer's account of Vygotsky's theory, also had a very similar idea. He called it progressive continuous recontextualization, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I think it means pretty much the same thing. In both cases, they had in mind something like this cyclical movement, a very creative process. They probably both used a spiral to represent it, to show how over time new schemes and schemas are introduced. To simplify things, we've kept to the two-dimensional version here. One significant thing about it is we're talking here about both mind and body being involved in both perception and in learning. And many theorists have taken this up, and often it's referred to as embodied cognition now. It's not just cognition in the mind, it's something that involves the body as well, and the affordances of different objects and material in the environment that the child engages with is very significant. And it was Eleanor Gibson in her research with the virtual cliff who identified a great deal about affordances, and we can draw upon that as well. So there are a number of different theoretical bases for the basic mechanism in our model. To take it a little bit further, we want to talk a little bit about the zone of proximal development, Vygotsky's idea of how scaffolding is provided to children. And to represent that, I want to talk about, first of all, how children learn quite naturally, and they learn despite the fact that anxiety is involved in learning, in trying out something new and exploring. But innately, children are hardwired to explore. The alternative would be to be very bored. So they interact with their environment quite naturally, and they learn. So there is a learning curve. It can be a very steep learning curve for some children, and we know that there are risk factors that get in the way. Research identifies the effects of poverty, poor bonding, the anxiety and depression of caregivers obviously has an effect on all of that. A lack of stimulation if the environment isn't enriched, inconsistency in the parenting, and lack of aspiration. You know, children not being expected to achieve very much holds them back too. Now there are other things, but a great deal of research has identified those things, and it has also identified how we can actually provide resilience through family intervention and in the effective provision of preschool education. We know that effective preschools can actually provide the scaffolding to support children, to nurture their learning, and so that they achieve more than they would otherwise achieve through this scaffolding idea. And we're talking about scaffolding, which Vygotsky referred to as a zone of proximal development, an area where children can achieve more than they would naturally because they're given the support from a peer or an adult. Despite the anxiety that's involved in that. And I think this is important that we recognise. I think it's fairly obvious if we think of a child stepping off a wall for the first time, that is stressful, and that if an adult is holding the child's hand and encouraging them to make that first step, it will develop their confidence and they'll be able to do it for themselves afterwards. I think it's much harder for us as adults to recognise that the same kind of anxiety and stress is involved in forming a circle with a crayon for the very first time, or for counting, or for forming the letters of your name. But there is stress, and you know, children are aware from an early age that they can get it wrong, and they're anxious to get it right and to do it properly. So they need scaffolding. We need to be very attentive to where they're at the moment, and give them very appropriate challenges and not take them out of that zone. No. One of the things we discovered in our observations of children in play was that they learn for themselves in free flow play, and we applied the zone of proximal development in this because we realised that they were self-scaffolding. The schema that they already had, the interests in dinosaurs or transport or superheroes, provided figurative context for learning new schemes. And children also, those schemes that they're applying, transporting or containing or grouping, classification, were actually providing a means by which they could develop new schemas. So the zone of proximal development doesn't just apply to the adult scaffolding they play, but it also includes the scaffolding through flow. And we use the word flow very carefully here because the research from Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi in particular has provided masses of evidence that when people are in heightened states of learning or creativity, in all kinds of contexts, adults and children, they've described it as being in flow. And where children are totally self-absorbed, Tina Bruce did a wonderful job of describing this in her texts. The child is able to support the scaffold themselves and support their own learning. Now the adult's role in this is beyond that. Partly it's to protect that space for them to learn, but also to provide the kind of environmental resources that make it enriched. So this is our complete model that we've developed. I'm not going to take you any further today, but I'll leave that for future presentations, except to say that these two circles that we've added to the outside, the one on the top left-hand corner, is the adult's role. And they're also a learning system, so they have schemas and schemes as well. And in SchemaPlay, which we try to support them with the pedagogical content knowledge that they need, the understanding of progression in schemes and schemas that allow them to support children and scaffold the children's learning in their free flow play. In the bottom right hand corner we have another system that affects the free flow play, from the play of peers, from the imitation that they take place from the adult world as well, and all kinds of contexts where they observe other behaviours. So in terms of the foundational theories of our work, we draw on Lev Vygotsky with the zone of proximal development. We also have, with our understanding of play itself, we're drawing upon, crucially, Piaget's distinction between a scheme and a schema. Lev Vygotsky's also understanding of the mechanism of creativity. Eleanor Gibson's work, Chris Athey I've mentioned, Tina Bruce. Kathy Nutbrown's actually identified a lot of the challenges here, which are very valuable. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi as well, and his concept of flow. We've got Albert Bandura, who's written so much about modelling and imitation, and that's been developed further. We have Rizzolatti, and the neuroscientists have taken that even further with mirror neurons, which provides perhaps the first concrete evidence of all of this. We've also found it useful to read the work of Vera John Steiner, who talks a lot about emotional scaffolding and the way that we can support children. And the biggest way, of course, in this context, is to protect children's free flow play, to actually allow them to play, to give them the space to do it, and not to interrupt it too often, to add or to support it. Now, all those theorists, why haven't I read this before? I think personally that it's to do with separate disciplines. We get so wrapped up with how different theorists disagree with each other that we don't take the time to actually look at what they agree on and how we can build on those aspects that they do have in common. It was actually Piaget who first coined the word transdisciplinary research and analysis back in the 70s. I think we need much more of that in all kinds of contexts in life. If you're interested in learning more about what we're providing in SchemaPlay and the training that we're providing for practitioners, you'll find details on SchemaPlay website, and also we've got a text that's available also on Amazon, which outlines the theory as well. Thank you for listening, and as I said, we'll add a little more in future presentations.